She stood frozen at the edge of the rooftop, one hand resting on her growing belly as the man who promised her something real lowered himself onto one knee, just not for her. Cameras flashed. A ring sparkled, and in that instant, Elena's miracle met its sharpest test. Have you ever poured your love, your hope, your body into someone, only to watch them offer your dream to another woman? Elena waited years for one blessing, and when it finally came, her heart broke in front of the world. But what if this moment isn't the end? What if it's the doorway to her becoming stronger than she ever imagined? Before we continue, let's pause. Dear God, comfort every woman listening who has loved deeply, waited patiently, and been hurt silently. Restore hope, grant strength, and remind us that we are never forgotten. Amen. If stories of love, betrayal, and healing speak to you, tap the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. This story will stay with you. At 34, Elena Hart lived in a town where everyone seemed to know. Everyone, and that included the quiet things people didn't say out loud. Briar Ridge was the kind of place with second-hand bookstores, homemade pies at the corner diner, and neighbors who left handwritten notes when they borrowed sugar. To others, it seemed idyllic. To Elena, it was safe, still, predictable. But safety doesn't fill empty arms. She hadn't always lived alone. There was a time, 8 years ago, when her laughter filled a house. She shared with a man who once said he'd love her no matter what. That promise faded under hospital lights and silent car rides home from fertility appointments. His name was Daniel, and for a while, she believed they'd build a life that included scraped knees, bedtime stories, and the lullaby hum of a baby monitor in the hall. But after years of trying, IVF cycles that left her body bruised, miscarriages that made her chest ache, with a pain too complex to name, and one final medical report that whispered unlikely, he left. He didn't say much when he packed, just stood in the hallway and said, "I need more. I need a life with a future," as if she wasn't still one. Elena didn't cry the way women do in the movies. There was no dramatic collapse on the floor. She simply stood there, a grocery list still clutched in her hand, her body aching from hormones and hope gone wrong. That was the last time she tried to become a mother with someone else. She rebuilt in small pieces. Mornings became routines, coffee with oat milk, a walk by the lake, journaling before heading to work. Her job as an art therapist gave her meaning. She specialized in working with children, many from broken homes, trauma backgrounds, or emotional neglect. They didn't speak much with words, but their brushstrokes told stories she understood without needing translation. There was Ava, who used only red until Elena taught her how to blend orange and pink. Marcus, who tore every canvas until he finally left one hole. These children didn't need her to be a mother. They just needed her to show up. And she did, every single day. Still, the ache remained. Her home was a modest cottage tucked beneath tall pines near the quieter edge of Briar Ridge. It had creaking wood floors, a sunroom filled with half-finished canvases, and an attic studio that smelled faintly of lemon oil and turpentine. It wasn't grand, but it was hers. On weekends, she'd prop open the windows and paint as golden light poured in. Often she painted families, mothers holding children close, hands clasped tightly, eyes filled with warmth. It wasn't intentional. Her hands simply reached for the image her heart longed for. She didn't tell anyone how often she dreamed of soft cries in the night, or the instinct to cradle something that was never there. Her friends stopped asking about motherhood after a while. Well-meaning suggestions faded into silence. The baby showers became easier to skip. Her social circle shifted into something quieter, book clubs, soup nights, and her closest friend, Neve, who never pushed for explanations. Nev just brought warm tea and held space. One winter evening, Elena sat alone in her attic, a canvas before her, brushes resting in her palm. Outside, snow drifted in slow, heavy flakes, wrapping the world in stillness. Her fireplace crackled downstairs, untouched. A pot of lentil stew sat uneaten. She didn't feel like painting a family tonight. Instead, she painted a single candle in the center of a dark room. The light flickered gently, defiantly. When it was finished, she stared at it for a long time. That was how she felt, small, lit, and alone in a space where most people only saw the dark. She didn't pity herself. She was past that. But sometimes she allowed herself 5 minutes. 5 minutes to close her eyes, place a hand over her belly, and whisper a quiet, broken prayer into the air. If not now, maybe never, and if never, please help me still live fully. Briar Ridge moved at its own pace. No one rushed. The seasons came faithfully. Winter with its hush, spring with its thaw, and summer with its laughter drifting from porch swings. Alina marked time in cups of paint water and dried flower petals pressed between pages. But time still passed. Every so often, she'd pass the maternity aisle in the town's small department store. She'd glance, never stare, at the soft cotton onesies and the pastel crib blankets. She didn't buy them. She never had, not even during the hopeful years. It always felt like tempting fate. Yet even in her unspoken grief, Alina had become something steady. She was the one people called when they didn't know how to explain what they felt. She taught the kids who couldn't sit still how to breathe through color. She stayed up late writing curriculum for a nonprofit that served low-income families. She made meals for elderly neighbors, fed the ducks at the frozen edge of the lake, and told herself that joy didn't always have to look like motherhood. But every now and then, she'd wake from a dream where she was holding a child, whose face she couldn't see, and her chest would ache with both love and loss. Some women measured their lives in years or achievements. Alina measured hers in cycles, hopeful beginnings, quiet endings, month after month, until eventually she stopped counting, not out of bitterness, but as an act of self-preservation. Yet beneath her grace was a woman who had tasted grief in slow, steady spoonfuls. She never resented mothers, those pushing strollers, those laughing over spilled juice boxes, those who looked tired in the most beautiful way. She admired them, but admiration carried its own sting. There were days she could speak easily about her past, and there were days she couldn't look in the mirror without hearing the words of the last specialist she saw. "There's nothing more we can do." "I'm sorry." She nodded politely at the time, thanked him, took the packet of information she never read, and walked to her car like the wind had left her lungs. That night, she painted a tree with no leaves, no branches, just roots. She called it Still Here. In town, she was known for her kindness, for the soft way she listened, for how she spoke to children as though their voices mattered. People said she had a calming presence. No one ever asked how she'd learned to carry calm like armor. She'd made peace with a quiet life, or so she told herself. She woke up early, lit candles before dawn, and read devotionals by the window. She prayed, not always for a child, not anymore, but for peace, for meaning, for the courage to keep hoping for beauty in a story that hadn't gone the way she planned. Her students brought her joy. They reminded her that love didn't have to come in traditional shapes. She saw beauty in their chaos, in their pain, in the way they trusted her with their hearts through brush and color. They called her Miss Alina like it was a badge of warmth, and some days that word, Miss, echoed deeper than they knew. One morning, after a particularly hard therapy session with a withdrawn teenage girl named Joy, Alina sat in the staff kitchen, her coffee untouched. "I don't think I'm helping her," she whispered to Neve, who had come to drop off a book. Nev tilted her head. "You don't see it, do you?" "See what?" "The way she looks at you, like someone who's finally safe." Alina's throat tightened. She blinked away the feeling, then reached for her mug. It wasn't motherhood in the way she dreamed, but it mattered, deeply. Still, the ache never truly left. She'd grown so used to living with it that it became part of her, like background noise, like the way her hands always found each other when she walked alone. Some evenings she'd pause before bed, her fingers grazing her stomach, not to mourn, but to remember that once she believed life could grow there. That belief wasn't fully gone, just hidden. Every year on her birthday she'd take a walk to the far side of the lake, where the trees dipped low and the water stilled in quiet reverence. She'd sit on the same wooden bench, write herself a letter and tuck it into the hollow of a nearby oak tree. She never reread the old ones. She just wrote what her heart couldn't say out loud. This year's letter was different. You are allowed to want more, even if it hurts, even if it seems foolish. Hope does not make you weak, it makes you brave. By the time winter deepened and the days grew shorter, Alina had settled into a life of gentle rhythms. Her studio stayed open longer. She took on more community projects. She hosted a grief art class once a week, and while she never shared her own story, her presence said enough. On a particularly cold Friday evening, as she packed up after the session, a local event flyer caught her eye on the bulletin board. Winter Lights Charity Fundraiser, sponsored by Dane Tech Foundation. She didn't know then how that name, Silas Dane, would change everything. She didn't know that this season of stillness was only the pause before an unexpected chapter. But that night, as she left the building, she noticed a single child's painting, left behind, a woman holding a lantern, standing alone in a field of snow. The sky around her was dark, but her light shone bright. Alina smiled softly, tucked the painting under her arm, and walked into the night. The night of the Winter Lights fundraiser arrived with soft candlelight glowing from shop windows and delicate strings of white bulbs lining the town square. Briar Ridge had always kept its celebrations modest, intimate, rather than extravagant. But this event felt different. There was a quiet buzz in the air, an undercurrent of anticipation that Alina couldn't quite place. She wasn't planning to attend until her coworker begged her to come support the art students who had contributed pieces to the silent auction. So she arrived just after 6, dressed in a navy blue sweater dress. Her hair swept into a loose bun, cheeks flushed from the cold. The community center had been transformed for the evening, round tables adorned with centerpieces made by local school kids, soft music humming beneath the gentle hum of conversation. On the far wall, children's artwork hung with clothespins and string. Alina smiled as she recognized a few of her students' pieces. She was standing near the punch table, trying to decide whether to stay or slip out early, when she noticed him. He stood out, not because he tried to, but because some people naturally carry a kind of quiet command. Tall, dressed in a tailored charcoal coat and scarf, he had the air of someone used to observing before speaking. His gaze moved carefully over the artwork, lingering longer than most. What struck her wasn't his appearance, though he was striking. It was the stillness in his body, the way he folded his hands behind his back, the way he leaned in slightly when reading the title cards, as if the art whispered something no one else could hear. "Do you know who that is?" whispered a voice beside her. Alina turned to see a volunteer pointing discreetly toward the man. "That's Silas Dane," the woman continued. "From the city, owns that tech company. He bought the old Ashcroft estate, apparently planning to turn it into some kind of outreach center." Alina blinked. The Ashcroft estate had sat abandoned for years, wrapped in ivy and rumors. It was massive, a piece of history tucked between the hills outside town. No one expected it to ever come alive again. "He's funding this whole event," the woman added. "Strange type, though. Doesn't talk much. Doesn't smile." A few moments later, Silas approached the display where Alina's students' work hung. His eyes settled on a piece signed by Joy, the same girl who rarely spoke during sessions. The painting was simple, blended pastels forming the silhouette of a girl walking alone through tall grass, arms open toward the sky. "Alina Hart," he read aloud, spotting the small curator tag under the piece. His voice was deep, smooth, measured. "That's me," Alina replied, stepping forward. He turned toward her, nodding once. "This one, it's honest, not forced." Alina tilted her head. "Joy doesn't say much, but she paints what she feels. She's lucky to have someone who listens." There was no flattery in his tone, no pretense, just an observation that landed heavier than it should have. Alina gave a small smile, unsure how to respond. "I've seen your work before," he said next, eyes now on her face. "You painted the lake mural at the children's clinic." "I did," she said slowly. "Years ago. It's still the first thing people notice when they walk in." That brief exchange might have ended there, polite and forgettable. But Silas paused, looked back at the painting, then back at her. "I'm restoring the Ashcroft estate," he said. "I want part of it converted into an art studio, open to the public, for healing, expression, especially for kids." Alina raised an eyebrow. "In Briar Ridge? I grew up nearby. I owe this place more than people think." The way he said it held weight, like there was a history under the surface he wasn't quite ready to share. "I need someone to oversee the creative direction," he continued. "Someone who knows how to make art feel like sanctuary. Your name came up twice, once from the mayor, once from a student's parent." Alina's brows lifted. "You've done your research. I don't make decisions casually." There was a pause. The music shifted. Laughter rippled across the room behind them. But between them, it was still. "I'd like to talk more," he said. "Would you meet me for coffee this week?" She hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because it felt sudden, strange, out of rhythm with the way her life normally moved. Yet something about his presence wasn't aggressive or persuasive. It was respectful, grounded. "I'm free Thursday," she said finally. "Thursday, it is." He nodded once, then walked away. The next day, Alina found herself thinking about the conversation more than she expected. Not just his offer, but the way he watched the children's artwork, the way he noticed the mural from years ago, the way he asked for her time without demanding it. That Thursday, they met at Briar Ridge's only cafe, a warm place with hand-painted mugs and bookshelves filled by donations. Silas wore a black wool coat and gloves he removed with quiet care before shaking her hand. He didn't waste time with small talk. "I'm building more than a center," he said, once they were seated. "I'm building something I wish I had when I was younger." Alina didn't ask for details. Not yet. She just listened. He laid out blueprints, sketches, and design mock-ups. But he wasn't focused on decor. He wanted soul, color, space for grief and healing. "I've hired architects, but I need someone who sees the world the way your work does. Someone who understands how much a painting can say when words fall short." Alina was quiet for a long moment, then replied, "You're not just asking for a muralist, you're asking for a partner in vision." He nodded. Exactly. They began meeting weekly, then twice a week, then almost every other day. At first it was purely professional. Conversations about lighting, layout, accessibility, and how to make creative spaces feel like emotional shelters. But slowly, the lines blurred. Not in any dramatic way, but through small moments. A shared laugh over coffee spilled on a blueprint. A long silence held comfortably between them as they stared at wall samples. The way he never interrupted her when she spoke. The way she stopped noticing the scar near his temple and started wondering how it got there. He didn't talk about his childhood, but she could tell it wasn't easy. Sometimes, when a child's story came up during planning, his jaw would tighten just slightly. He always noticed the smallest details in her sketches, like how her trees leaned slightly to the left, or how she shaded the light as if it were always reaching, never resting. Their connection wasn't instant fireworks. It was slower, warmer, a quiet unfolding of mutual respect and unspoken understanding. By the fourth week, Alina noticed something about Silas that others might miss. He listened with intention. When he asked a question, he waited, not just for an answer but for truth. He never filled silence just to fill it. And in a world that moved too quickly, that kind of presence stood out. Their meetings moved from the cafe to the estate. The property was massive, aged stone, arched windows, forgotten gardens reclaiming their space. As she walked through the dusty halls for the first time, blueprints tucked under her arm, Alina felt something stir inside her. "This place," she said quietly, "has seen joy and grief. You can feel it in the walls." Silas, standing beside her with his hands in his coat pockets, nodded. "I want to bring both into the light, not hide them." He didn't look at her when he said it, but something about his posture told her he knew grief all too well. One afternoon, as they stood in what used to be a ballroom, sunlight spilled through the tall windows, scattering across the floor. "I want this space for the children," Silas said. "Not to perform, just to exist, to create, to let the weight fall off for a while." Alina walked slowly through the room, envisioning easels, soft lighting, shelves of supplies, cozy corners for rest. "I'd call it the quiet room," she whispered. He looked up. "That's perfect." There were no accolades or grand compliments, just shared vision, shared silence, shared hope. One evening, Alina stayed late to sketch ideas for a mural near the entryway. She didn't hear Silas enter the room until he placed a cup of peppermint tea beside her. "You've been here for hours." She smiled, brushing graphite from her fingers. "I lost track of time." He looked at the drawing she was working on, an outline of hands, open and reaching, not desperate but offering. "It's beautiful," he said softly. She glanced at him. "Do you ever draw?" He shook his head. "No, but I used to watch my mother paint, before everything changed." That was the first time he mentioned her. He didn't say more, and Alina didn't press. But something shifted. Over the next few weeks, their conversations wandered. They spoke of art, of memory, of the strange way certain smells could transport you to another time. He asked her about her students. She told him about the girl who only painted with her fingers, and the boy who once screamed for 20 minutes before quietly asking to borrow a pencil. Silas listened with a focus that made her feel seen. He shared pieces of himself in fragments, a father who vanished, a brother, lost too soon, the kind of childhood that forces you to grow up early. Alina never judged his distance. Some people build walls not to hide but to survive. She found herself looking forward to their meetings, not just for the work, but for the peace in his presence. The way her chest didn't tighten around him. The way she didn't feel small or less than. With Silas, there were no pitying looks, no careful questions about children or marriage. Just curiosity, respect. It was refreshing. They began spending time together outside the estate. A quick lunch at the cafe, a walk by the lake when the snow started to melt. One evening, he invited her to view an exhibit in the city, an art show centered around healing and memory. They drove in silence for most of the trip, but it wasn't awkward. It felt natural, like being next to someone who didn't need noise to prove connection. At the gallery, they moved through the pieces slowly. One sculpture stopped them both, a simple form of a mother holding an empty blanket. No face, no child, just the gesture. Alina stood in front of it for a long time. Silas stepped beside her. You see yourself in her? It wasn't a question. Alina's voice was barely a whisper. I used to. Silas didn't speak. He just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, as if anchoring her to the moment. When they left the gallery, neither spoke about the sculpture again, but the air between them felt different. Closer, maybe, or simply more honest. Late one night back at the estate, Alina was finishing a mural draft when she felt his gaze settle on her from across the room. You work like it's sacred, he said. She looked up. It is. He stepped closer. What would you paint if no one ever saw it? She paused, then replied, a child reaching for the sky, even if they never touch it, just reaching. Silas said nothing for a moment, then quietly added, You give hope shape. It wasn't flirtation, it was reverence. And for Alina, that meant more. Still, she guarded herself. She'd been drawn in by tenderness before, words wrapped in warmth, arms that felt like home, until they didn't. But this felt different, not because it was exciting, but because it was steady, grown, slow, and sometimes slow is what healing looks like. When Silas offered her the official contract to lead the creative direction of the estate studio, she hesitated only for a moment before signing, not just because it was her dream job, but because she believed in the man who had trusted her with the vision. It was the first time in a long while she said yes to something without fear. The first time Silas held her hand, it was quiet, almost unnoticeable. No grand gesture, no sweeping moment. Just his fingers brushing hers as they walked along the lake path behind the estate, and then staying there like it had always belonged. They had finished reviewing plans for the community studio earlier that afternoon, but neither seemed eager to part ways. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a soft gold across the water. A light breeze tugged at the hem of Alina's coat as the two of them followed, the path lined with wildflowers clinging to the last of the season. They walked in silence for a while. Then Silas said softly, You always talk about what art gives to others, but what does it give to you? Alina glanced toward the water, watching ducks glide across the surface. It gives me somewhere to put the ache. He looked at her, and she could feel the weight of it. Not pressure, but presence. That's something I understand, he replied. As they reached the bend in the path, they arrived at an old willow tree. Its long branches swaying gently, brushing the ground like a curtain of green silk. The tree stood tall near the edge of the lake, with roots stretching into the soil like arms embracing the earth. Alina paused, her hand still in his. This tree, she murmured. I used to come here when I needed to breathe. Silas followed her gaze. It feels safe, she nodded, like it's kept every secret I've ever whispered. They stood beneath it, letting the hanging branches enclose them in their own little world. Alina turned to face him. Can I ask you something? Always, he said. What do you see when you look at me? His brow furrowed, not from confusion, but from the weight of the question. I see someone who carries sorrow like a hymn, he said slowly. But you don't let it define you. I see a woman who shows up for others when it would be easier to shut the door. I see strength without noise. Her throat tightened. Even though I can't. He stepped closer. Your ability to give life isn't tied to whether or not you carry a child. You breathe life into people every day. Alina lowered her gaze, struggling to hold the swell in her chest. I've spent years wondering if anyone would ever really want me. Not in spite of what I've been through, but because of it. Silas lifted her chin gently. I don't want you in pieces. I want you exactly as you are. That night, She let herself rest in his arms, beneath the willow tree, her head on his shoulder, the hush of the lake around them. He didn't rush anything. He didn't need to. It wasn't about romance in the way movies paint it. There were no dramatic speeches or background music. Just warmth, presence, a stillness that felt safe. The days that followed moved with a new softness. They still met for work, still discussed plans and layouts and materials, but something had shifted. His glances lingered longer. Her laughter came more easily. They shared meals, shared silences, shared the gentle unfolding of trust. One evening, Silas brought her a sketchbook. "I notice you never sketch for yourself anymore," he said. She flipped through the empty pages, her fingers brushing lightly over the surface. "I think I forgot how to make art that isn't for someone else." "Then let this be just for you," he replied. Later that night, she sat in her studio with the sketchbook open on her lap. For the first time in a long while, she let her hand move without direction. What appeared on the page was simple: a woman standing under a willow, eyes closed, heart open. Silas didn't ask for her past, but she offered it anyway. One evening, as they shared dinner at her cottage, she told him everything: the years of trying, the failed cycles, the husband who left, the doctor who said she'd never hold a child of her own. Her voice didn't shake. It had been told before, though never with this kind of raw honesty. He listened with quiet reverence, never interrupting, never looking away. When she finished, he reached across the table, fingers threading through hers. "I can't take away what you've walked through," he said gently, "but I can be someone who never makes you feel alone in it again." It was in the small things that she began to fall. The way he remembered how she took her tea. The way he never reached to fix her, only to hold space. The way he could be strong without needing to control. It was healing, but not in the way people often assume healing looks. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about being with someone who didn't treat it like baggage, who saw the scars and still stayed. She often caught herself smiling without reason. Her best friend Nev noticed first. "You're different lately," Nev said one morning as they walked through the local market. "Softer." Elena shrugged, a blush warming her cheeks. "I think I just feel seen." Nave paused. "After everything, you deserve that." One evening, as twilight settled, Silas met her outside her cottage. "I don't know what this is going to become," he said honestly, his hands in his pockets. "But I know this: I feel something with you that I haven't felt in a long time. If ever." Elena stepped closer, heart steady but open. "I'm not expecting perfection, just honesty. You'll always get that from me," he promised. And for once, she believed it. Have you ever loved someone who made you feel whole again? Someone who didn't just love the best parts of you, but stayed through the hard ones too? Tell us in the comments. And if you're feeling this story, tap that like button so more people can discover it too. It happened one evening when the sky was fading from amber to blue and the scent of early autumn clung to the air. Alina had invited Silas to a community showcase her students were displaying. Artwork at the town library, many of them for the first time. Children stood nervously by their pieces, families gathered in small circles, and the air was thick with quiet pride. Silas walked beside her, greeting students with genuine curiosity, asking questions about color choices and themes. He wasn't pretending to care. He truly did. And Alina noticed how the kids lit up around him, especially the ones who usually kept to themselves. Afterward, they strolled back toward her cottage on foot, the evening calm around them like a hush between pages. "That boy, Eli," Silas said, "the one who painted the mountains with the gold thread, reminded me of my brother." Alina looked up at him. He didn't speak more about it, but that single sentence told her there were stories still folded within him. They sat on the steps of her front porch, sipping warm cider from mismatched mugs. "I've spent so much of my life holding my breath," she admitted quietly. "Afraid to hope, afraid to start over. Because the last time I believed in something, it broke me." Silas looked at her, not with pity, but with patience. "You're not broken, you're healing." She tilted her head. "How do you know the difference?" "Because broken things stay shattered, but healing things, they keep moving even when it hurts." His words didn't solve anything, but they settled into her, warm and solid. That night, when he kissed her for the first time, it wasn't under dramatic lighting or at some perfect moment. It was on that same porch with the creak of wood beneath them and the hum of crickets in the grass. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His lips were gentle, reverent. as though he was asking permission with every breath. Alina felt her heart press forward, not with fear, but with trust. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean into what felt good, without questioning when it would end. They didn't rush anything. Silas never pressured her. He didn't demand titles or declarations. He showed up, consistently, with warmth in his voice and steadiness in his eyes. He brought her lunch on days she was too tired to cook, left her notes tucked between her brushes when she forgot to take breaks. Once he repaired the studio door when it jammed, leaving a bouquet of wildflowers on the table afterward. "I didn't know you were the type to bring flowers," she teased. "I'm not," he said, "but you deserve them anyway." They had hard conversations too. Alina shared the fear that lingered, the worry that all of this was too good to last, that one day he'd wake up and realize he wanted someone who could give him a more traditional life, someone without scars, without losses, without years of buried pain. But Silas never made her feel like she had to earn love. He simply loved her, quietly, without pretense. "You think your scars make you less," he told her once, brushing her hand with his thumb. "But they're just proof that you kept going." One afternoon, he brought her to the estate's east wing, recently cleaned and ready for design. "I want you to paint here," he said. "Not for the project, for yourself." The room was filled with soft light and faced the lake. Alina ran her hand along the windowsill, stunned. "Why this space?" "Because you need somewhere that belongs to you. A room where you don't have to carry anyone else's weight." She looked at him, eyes glistening. "You really see me?" "I always have," he said. And he did. He saw the woman who still flinched when asked about her past, the one who smiled easily but guarded her heart with quiet grace. He saw the artist, the mentor, the dreamer, the one who had loved and lost and kept going anyway. He didn't just love her light, he stood by her shadows too. Weeks passed, and their rhythm settled into something deeply peaceful. He made her feel safe, not just physically, but emotionally. She never had to pretend, never had to shrink herself. With Silas, she could exhale. It was the kind of connection that didn't require constant assurance. It just was. She found herself sketching more, writing more, laughing more. There was a softness in her life now. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could be this quiet, this real. One evening, they returned to the willow tree. It had become their place, the one constant in their story so far. Alina leaned back against the trunk, Silas beside her, his arm wrapped gently around her waist. "Do you believe in soulmates?" she asked. He paused. "I believe in timing, in choices, in people who meet us when we're finally ready to be loved." "Well," she smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd feel this again," she whispered. "Peace, safety, something like hope." Silas pressed a kiss to her temple. "You deserve all of it," he said. Alina had been feeling tired for days, more than usual. It started with heavy eyelids mid-morning, followed by a strange sensitivity to certain smells. She'd brushed it off at first, blaming long work hours or the shifting weather. But when she found herself turning away from her favorite tea one morning, because the scent suddenly made her stomach turn, she paused. Something inside her stirred, quietly, cautiously. She didn't want to give the thought language. Didn't dare. The idea felt fragile, like a paper lantern in the wind, and she was too afraid to reach for it, lest it disappear again. It wasn't until a week later, when she nearly fell asleep during one of her student sessions, that Neve raised an eyebrow. "You're not sick," Neve said. "You're glowing." Alina laughed nervously. "That's a generous interpretation." Neve tilted her head. "You haven't been like this since—" Alina's smile faded. "I know." That evening, alone in her bathroom, she sat on the edge of the tub, hands clenched around a test she hadn't bought in years. It had sat in the back of a drawer beneath old lotions and forgotten lip balm. She wasn't even sure it hadn't expired, but she couldn't ignore the possibility any longer. Her heart thudded as she took the test and placed it on the counter. 2 minutes. She paced the floor. A minute more. She refused to look. Instead, she prayed, not for a result, but for the courage to accept whatever came. When she finally turned back to the counter, the small screen had already spoken, positive. Her knees buckled slightly. She dropped to the floor, not from fear, not immediately, but from the flood of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Her hands trembled as she touched her abdomen, as if trying to sense the life growing quietly inside her. Tears welled and fell without resistance. For a moment, the silence of the room was replaced by the sound of her breathing, shallow, then sharp, then breathless. A cry escaped her lips. Soft at first, then louder. Not of pain, not quite joy. Something deeper, a release. Years of loss, doubt, disappointment, melting into a single, sacred moment. "I'm pregnant," she whispered to no one. Then again, louder this time. "I'm pregnant." The following day, the blood tests confirmed it. The doctor smiled gently as she handed Alina a printed copy of the results. "There it is," she said softly. A strong start. Alina sat in her car for 10 full minutes afterward, gripping the steering wheel, her heart pounding. She didn't start the engine. She just sat there, replaying every word, every moment. As she reached into her purse to grab her phone, her fingers hesitated over Silas's contact. How do you tell someone your entire world just shifted? She typed a dozen different messages, deleted them all, then settled on, "Can you come over? There's something I need to tell you." He arrived later that evening, his coat dusted with the light flurries that had started to fall. His face held its usual calm expression, though he tilted his head slightly when he stepped inside and saw the look in her eyes. "What's going on?" he asked. Alina didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the coffee table where the test sat beside a folded paper towel. Next to it was the ultrasound photo from that morning. Just a small black and white image. A flicker. She handed it to him, without speaking. Silas took it, studied it for a moment, then looked at her. The silence between them stretched longer than she expected. Finally, he whispered, "You're..." She nodded. His reaction was unexpected. He didn't pull her into his arms or cry or speak in rapid excitement. He stepped back slightly, as if trying to catch his breath. Then he moved forward, wrapped his arms around her and held her close, his hand on the back of her head, the other gently resting on her lower back. "Thank you," he said into her hair. "Thank you for this gift." But something in his voice didn't match the words. Alina didn't know how to explain it, only that something shifted in the room. She felt warmth and distance, all at once. Later that night, he kissed her forehead before leaving, promising to call in the morning. She stood by the window, watching him walk to his car. He didn't look back. The following days brought a flood of new sensations. Tenderness in her body, waves of fatigue, strange cravings that had her reaching for fruit she never ate and crying over songs on the radio. But beneath it all was joy. Not loud, not explosive, but soft, like a secret she could finally hold. She painted again. Vivid colors, warm tones. Her brush moved with purpose, as if her soul had new instructions. She began keeping a journal for the baby, writing little notes, memories, names she was considering. There was a glow about her now, not from makeup, not from good sleep. It came from somewhere much deeper. But Silas didn't call the next morning, or the next. And when he finally did, the warmth in his voice had dimmed slightly. He spoke kindly, asked how she was feeling, promised they'd talk more soon. But his tone was careful, distant, as if his body was near, but his mind had gone somewhere else. Alina didn't confront him, not yet. She told herself he was just overwhelmed, processing. Men needed time, too. This was big news. But the ache that used to live quietly in her heart had started to whisper again. And this time, she wasn't sure she was ready to listen. The following week unfolded like a delicate balance between wonder and uncertainty. Each morning, Alina woke with her hand resting gently on her belly, whispering small greetings to the life inside her. She talked to the baby while brushing her teeth, making breakfast, or sitting quietly by the window. "You're real," she would murmur. "You're here." She painted more than she had in months. Canvases filled with golden light, warm hues and curved lines that somehow echoed the gentle rhythm of her new reality. But as her belly grew softer and her body shifted, she couldn't ignore the other change. Silas had pulled back. His visits were less frequent, his messages shorter. His voice, though kind, had lost something. Presence. One afternoon, Alina stood in the art room at the estate, sketching nursery mural ideas on her tablet. When Silas walked in, she turned to greet him, a small smile on her lips. "You're here." "I had a meeting in town," he replied, placing his coat on a chair. "Thought I'd check on the build." There was an awkward pause. She could feel it. The version of him who once stayed late to brainstorm paint palettes was now watching the clock. She shifted the conversation gently. I started planning the nursery mural, something soft, maybe stars or a forest with animals, something peaceful. That's good, he said, his gaze unfocused. You've always had a vision. Alina lowered her hand slowly. You haven't asked me how I'm feeling. His eyes met hers. How are you feeling? She hesitated, her voice softer now. Happy, but also a little alone. Silas opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out. That evening she curled into bed with the blanket her grandmother had made, the one she'd packed away years ago, just in case. It smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. She wrapped it around her legs and placed both hands on her belly. The house was quiet, but her mind was loud. Was he pulling away because he was scared? Was it too soon, too real? Or was she watching the beginning of a familiar ending? Alina had always been strong, not because she never broke, but because she always found her way back to herself. So even in the uncertainty, she moved forward. She went to her doctor's appointments alone, listened to the heartbeat each time with tears in her eyes. She recorded it once on her phone, playing it back during the evenings she felt furthest from Silas. Thump, 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 thump. That sound meant she wasn't alone. Not anymore. Weeks passed, and with each one, her joy grew, but so did the space between them. Silas continued to support her from a distance. He offered to cover all expenses, sent her information on prenatal specialists. But she didn't need resources. She needed him. Or rather, the version of him who once brought her tea and asked her questions that made her feel known. That man had gone quiet. Then one Friday afternoon, Alina made a choice. She would go to the city, not to catch him off guard, not to accuse, just to see him, to remind herself that this was real, that she wasn't imagining the shift, that maybe, just maybe, something could be salvaged. She wore a simple gray sweater dress, the first to fit her growing bump, and packed a bag with the printed ultrasound and a tiny pair of socks she had bought after her second appointment. The drive to the city was calm, the road familiar from past visits. She knew where to find him. A networking event he'd mentioned weeks ago, a gathering for founders and creators. She had no plan to stay long, just to say hello, just to show him. The venue was high above the city, with sweeping glass walls and velvet ropes. Alina stepped through the entrance quietly, unnoticed. She spotted Silas near the center, dressed sharply, hands clasped in front of him, posture formal. He stood beside a woman in a silver gown. Cameras lined the far end of the room. Reporters hovered. People whispered. She smiled gently, fingers wrapping around the folded ultrasound in her purse. And then she saw it. He knelt. For a moment, her breath vanished. She couldn't hear the applause, couldn't see the lights. Everything blurred. Her eyes locked on the ring box. The woman's surprised smile. The camera, flashes. And then, her own heartbeat, pounding louder than anything else. She stumbled back a step, one hand gripping the small bump beneath her dress, the other tightening into a fist around the pair of socks she never got the chance to show him. She didn't cry. Not there. Not in front of them. She turned, calmly, and walked out the same way she came in. Only when she reached her car did the tears come. They weren't loud. They weren't wild. They were quiet, steady, like rain on glass. She clutched the ultrasound to her chest and whispered, "I'm so sorry, baby. I thought we had someone, but we don't." Then she wiped her eyes, started the engine, and drove home, her chest hollow, her spirit bruised, but not broken. Alina stared at the ceiling of her bedroom long after returning home. Her coat still hung by the door. Her boots, dusted with the city's grime, sat untouched. The ultrasound lay beside her on the bed, folded neatly, but somehow now felt like a secret she wasn't allowed to tell. She replayed the moment again and again. Silas, down on one knee, the flash of a ring, the woman's gasp, the applause. He had smiled, not the smile she knew, the soft private one he reserved for late-night walks and shared meals. No, this smile had edges, public, polished, performed. She felt sick. The next morning, the nausea came in waves, not just from the pregnancy, but from something deeper. She held herself upright at the kitchen counter, fingers wrapped around a cold glass of water, knuckles pale. Her body trembled. Not from weakness, but from the collision of disbelief and realization. He had chosen someone else. Not in secret, not quietly, in front of cameras, with fanfare, and he knew Alina was carrying his child. He had kissed her stomach only a week ago, whispered, "I still can't believe this is real," and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. She pressed her palm against her belly now, gently, protectively. "I won't let you feel this," she whispered. "You don't deserve it." For 3 days, she didn't answer her phone. She ignored the missed calls. The messages, the name Silas lighting up her screen felt surreal, like a stranger was trying to reach her from some far-off life. She didn't want answers. She wanted to forget she ever believed him. Flashbacks found her when she least expected them. The willow tree, the sketchbook he gave her, the day he brought her soup when she felt faint, the first time he touched her stomach and whispered, "There's a heartbeat in there, and now I have 2 reasons to breathe." How easily words can turn hollow. Promises, she realized, aren't real if they disappear when tested. Alina sat at the edge of her bed, bent slightly forward, one hand gripping the sheet as a sharp wave of dizziness hit her. She hadn't eaten all day. Her body was trying to stay strong, but her heart wasn't cooperating. Her doctor's voice echoed in memory. "You need rest, nutrition, low stress." But how do you rest when your world has shifted overnight? How do you eat when your stomach turns at the thought of someone who once brought you joy? She didn't cry often, not anymore. But that night, she let it come. Fully. She curled on the couch, hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold, and sobbed. Silent, guttural, shaking. Not for him, not even for the loss, but for what she believed they were building, for the way she allowed herself to hope, for the little heart beating inside her that would never know what it meant to be welcomed with joy by both parents, at least not in the way she had dreamed. The town didn't know. Briar Ridge was quiet, shielded. It hadn't reached them yet, the engagement, the photos, the headlines, but she knew it would. Someone would see the news online. Someone would ask questions. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted to disappear. Nev showed up 2 days later without warning, letting herself in with a spare key in a grocery bag filled with warm bread, fruit, and herbal tea. "You didn't answer my messages," she said gently, placing the food on the counter. "I couldn't," Alina whispered. Nev wrapped her in a hug and said nothing. For the first time in days, Alina let herself rest her head on someone's shoulder. "He proposed," she said softly. "In front of cameras. I saw it." Nev held her tighter. "He knew," Alina added. "He knew I was pregnant." Nev's voice was firm but kind. "Then he made his choice. And now you get to make yours." That night, Alina packed a small bag and left the cottage. She couldn't stay there. Not with his scent on the pillow. Not with the paintings they'd talked about still waiting to be hung. She moved back into her childhood home, an old 2-story house where the stairs creaked and her teenage journals still sat in a box under the bed. Nev moved in temporarily, sleeping in the guest room. She made sure Alina ate, hydrated, walked, and didn't isolate. Together, they built a quiet rhythm of healing. The pain didn't vanish overnight, but in the stillness of those early days, Alina began to rebuild, quietly. She kept a journal next to her bed and wrote one thing she was grateful for each night. Some days it was small. "I felt the baby move today." Other days it was bolder. "I didn't cry when I heard his name." Each page was a tiny step forward. If you've ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted deeply, drop A in the comments. You're not alone. Healing takes time, but it starts with knowing your worth. In the weeks that followed, Alina moved differently. Not slower, but more deliberately. Every step felt earned. Every breath was a choice. She went back to teaching her art therapy classes, even if only part-time. The kids brought a quiet comfort. They didn't know. They didn't ask. They just painted. Wild colors, messy hands, honest hearts. One morning, a little boy named Henry tapped her arm and whispered, "You look like sunshine today." Alina smiled, eyes soft. "Thank you, sweetheart." It was the first time she'd smiled without forcing it. She cut off contact with Silas completely, blocked his number, removed his email, refused to open the letter he sent 2 weeks later, folded neatly, sitting untouched on her desk. She wasn't ready. Maybe she never would be. Her therapist reminded her that silence was also a decision. That self-protection was not cruelty. "I thought he was different," Elena said in one session. Her therapist nodded. He was, until he wasn't. And that change was not your fault. That sentence stayed with her. At night, Elena would sit by the window with her hand on her belly, whispering promises. I'll protect you. I'll love you every day. We'll be okay, just us. There was strength in saying it aloud. Strength in not pretending. She wasn't the kind of woman who needed rescuing. She was the kind who found her own way through the fire. Still, the loneliness stung sometimes, especially on quiet mornings, when the wind moved through the trees and the house felt too big. Especially when she woke from dreams where everything had gone right. She missed what they almost had. The way Silas looked at her beneath the willow, the warmth of his hands, the steadiness she thought would last. But she didn't miss the version of him who stood beside someone else with a ring in his hand and a camera watching. That man wasn't hers. Not anymore. Maybe not ever. One afternoon, while cleaning out her studio closet, she found the sketchbook he had given her. It was tucked beneath an old blanket, untouched since the last time they stood together in that room. She opened it slowly, page by page. Most of it was blank, but on one page near the middle, she had sketched a baby's hand, reaching upward, open, hopeful. She stared at it for a long while, then closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. Some chapters didn't need to be finished. Her best friend Nev planned a small gathering for her, just a few close friends, soft music, warm food, a celebration of this new life growing inside her. Not a shower, not yet, but a moment to be surrounded by love. Elena sat in a circle of women, each one offering blessings and quiet encouragement. No one mentioned Silas. They didn't have to. This space was hers. When the final candle was lit, Elena placed a hand over her belly and smiled. I may not know what the future looks like, she said, voice steady, but I know love when I feel it, and I feel it here. That night she stood on her porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching the stars. They blinked quietly above the trees, steady and ancient. She whispered a prayer under her breath, not for him, but for herself. God, thank you for removing anything that wasn't rooted in truth. Thank you for not letting me build on sand. And thank you for this child, who will never have to question whether they were wanted. And in that still moment, Elena knew, this pain would not break her. It had revealed her. And maybe, just maybe, it had set her free. Elena didn't disappear. She simply stepped back, from the world, from expectation, from the version of herself that always smiled through pain. With her best friend Nev by her side, she created a small, quiet life in the house she grew up in. The same walls that once held teenage dreams now held steady silence, and the occasional hum of a lullaby Elena hadn't finished writing. Her days became a rhythm. Not busy, not loud, but honest. Wake up, stretch, journal, eat something warm, take a walk, talk to the baby, then rest. A lot of rest, not because she was weak, but because healing asks for stillness. Nev never hovered. She moved like a gentle current, bringing soup, folding laundry sometimes, just sitting nearby with a book while Elena stared out the window. She's growing strong, Nev said once, placing her hand gently over Elena's stomach. And so are you. Elena didn't respond, but her eyes softened. Words didn't always need answers. Therapy became her safe space. She'd always believed in the power of emotional support. She was, after all, someone who had guided others through their pain. But now she was the one unraveling. I don't know who I am without this heartbreak, she admitted during one session. Her therapist leaned forward. Maybe you don't have to be without it. Maybe it's not about letting go, but about growing around it. Elena sat with that. Let it settle. She didn't need to forget. She just needed to learn how to carry it differently. Some days, the grief still caught her off guard. Like when she found one of Silas's old messages buried in a folder she thought she'd deleted. Or when a stranger at the market asked if the father was excited. Or when she accidentally opened a drawer and found the tiny baby socks again. But the breakdowns weren't setbacks. They were releases. Each tear, each wave, each deep breath afterward was a piece of her rebuilding. She returned to painting, slowly. At first, she could only bring herself to touch the brushes. Just hold them. Feel the shape in her fingers. There was a day she sat in front of the canvas for 4 straight hours and never made a stroke. But when she finally did, it was like exhaling after holding her breath far too long. She didn't paint pretty things. Not at first. She painted wounds, empty spaces, half-built bridges. Mothers standing alone in wide-open fields. But they weren't sad. They were strong, rooted, true. One canvas took weeks. She started with a storm, dark, heavy, layered, then added a figure, a woman with her back to the wind, hair blowing wildly, arms holding a child against her chest. Around them, a mess of broken shapes. But over time, she added something else. A sunrise, a new color, a path behind them, painted in gold. She titled it, Still Standing. That painting changed her, not because it made the pain vanish, but because it gave it a home. She hung it in her studio, right above the window that overlooked the old oak tree in the backyard. Every morning she looked at it and reminded herself, you survived. You didn't lose everything. You're building something new. She began leaving the house more. Not far, just little trips, to the bookstore, the co-op, the lakeside bench she used to sit on during early mornings. People asked kind questions, offered warm glances. No one pressed. She appreciated that. She wasn't ready to tell the whole story, but her body told part of it now, visibly growing, stretching with life. And even on the hardest days, the baby's soft movements reminded her she wasn't walking this road alone. One evening, she stood in front of the mirror after her bath, towel wrapped around her middle, hand resting on her round belly. You and me, little one, she whispered. And then, for the first time in a long while, she smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because she could finally see herself again. It was early morning when Alina found herself speaking out loud without meaning to. She had just opened the windows in her studio. The cool breeze wrapped around her shoulders as she stood in front of a fresh canvas, blank, untouched, full of possibility. I'm not broken, she said. The words surprised her, but they were true. She wasn't the woman who needed rescuing. She wasn't the girl begging to be seen. She was a woman who had endured and who, despite every disappointment, was still open to the light, even if it came slowly. Later that day, during therapy, she was asked to name what she had learned over the last few months. Alina thought for a while, then spoke softly, that I don't have to shrink to be loved, that silence can be healing, not punishment, that I'm allowed to start again, even if I'm scared. Her therapist nodded. And what do you want now? Alina smiled gently. Peace. Not the kind that comes when everything's quiet, but the kind that stays even when it isn't. Nev helped her put together a small space for the baby. Not a full nursery, just a quiet corner in her bedroom, with soft yellow curtains and a rocking chair Alina found at a thrift store. They painted the walls together, laughing through tears as Alina accidentally stepped into a tray of color. Welcome to motherhood, Neve teased. That evening, Alina sat in the rocking chair, looking around the space they'd created. It wasn't much, but it was sacred. It had been built with intention, with love, with healing. The baby kicked for the first time the next morning. She had just finished brushing her hair when she felt it, a soft flutter low in her belly, like the gentlest tap. Her breath caught. Tears filled her eyes. She placed both hands over the spot, standing perfectly still. You're here, she whispered. It wasn't a moment for anyone else. No cameras, no partner, no witnesses, just her and her child. And it was enough. One afternoon she walked down to the lake, the same lake she had once walked, with Silas, the same path where the willow tree still stood, unmoved by time. This time, she came alone. She sat on the bench beneath its shade, one hand resting on her stomach. And she spoke, not to Silas, but to the version of herself who once sat there with so much hope in her chest. I forgive you, she whispered to her younger self, for believing, for trusting, for not knowing what was to come. You were doing your best. Then she smiled, wiped her eyes, and stood. At home that evening, she returned to the large canvas in her studio, the one she had left unfinished for weeks. She picked up a brush and added something new, a mother's hand gently letting go of the past, not forced, not bitter, just open. And in the background, a rising sun, no longer behind her, now ahead. She realized something powerful in that moment. You don't have to return to who you were to heal. You can become someone entirely new, someone softer, stronger, wiser, not because pain changed you, but because you chose not to let it define you. Alina stood quietly, gazing at her painting. The baby kicked again, firmer this time, and she smiled. I know, she whispered. We're getting there. Sometimes our greatest growth comes after our deepest pain. If this part touched you, Hit that share button and help spread the message. You never know who might need it today. It started with a letter, not a text, not a voicemail. A handwritten envelope slid through her mail slot one quiet morning. Elena stood in the hallway, staring at it. Her name was written in ink, neat, controlled, unmistakably his. She turned it over once, then again. No return address. She placed it on the counter and walked away. It took her 3 days to open it. Inside was a note. No pleasantries, no defense, just a simple request. If you'll allow it, I'd like to see you. One conversation, no expectations, just honesty. Silas. She read it twice, then a third time. She didn't feel anger, just stillness. The ache had quieted since those early weeks, replaced by something steadier. Not forgiveness, not closure, clarity. Elena folded the letter and set it aside. She didn't answer right away, but by the end of the week, she sent a reply. Short, cautious, clear. The public garden, Sunday, noon, 1 hour. The day arrived clear and calm. Briar Ridge's public garden was blooming. Late spring had opened the earth's colors like a page turning slowly. Peonies, violets, soft bursts of white among green. Elena sat on a bench near the fountain, wearing a long linen dress, her hand resting over her belly. Nearly 7 months now. The baby was active and strong. A quiet wind stirred the petals at her feet. She didn't bring anger with her, only boundaries. Silas approached from a distance. He looked older, less polished, like someone who had traded certainty for reflection. The man who once walked with quiet confidence now moved with careful respect. He stopped a few feet from her. "May I sit?" he asked. She nodded once. Silence stretched between them. Finally he said, "You look radiant." She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. "The baby's healthy," she said, "growing fast." "I'm glad," he replied. Another silence. "I don't want to waste your time," Silas began. "I came to say what I should have said months ago, not to change the past, but to take responsibility for it." Elena watched him quietly, hands folded in her lap. He continued, "The woman I proposed to, it wasn't love. It wasn't even real. It was a deal pushed by people who care more about headlines than people, investors, board members. They wanted to stabilize my image before an international acquisition. I resisted at first, but they wore me down." He shook his head. "I know that sounds like an excuse. It isn't. It was a choice I made. A weak one I'll regret for the rest of my life." Elena's voice was calm. "Why didn't you tell me?" Silas looked down at his hands. "Because I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of what you'd think of me, of becoming a father, of how deeply I'd already fallen for you, and how much more I could lose if I let myself believe I deserved you." She held his gaze. "You were already losing me the moment you stopped being honest." He nodded. "I know." For a long moment, all she heard was the sound of the wind moving through the leaves. Silas turned slightly toward her. His voice was steadier now, lower. "I was raised to hide things, to stay quiet. My family, we survived by keeping secrets. I never learned how to tell the truth without feeling like it would cost me everything." He paused. "But with you, I wanted to be different. I just didn't know how to be that man and still hold on to everything I'd built." Elena felt the baby shift inside her. She placed her hand gently on her stomach, letting the motion ground her. "You held me," she said softly, with one hand, while holding everything else with the other. He swallowed hard. "And I lost both." She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply sat in the quiet strength she had earned. "You hurt me," she said, "not just with what you did, but with how easily you pulled away afterward. I felt abandoned, not just as a woman, but as the mother of your child." Silas closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing her words. "I can't undo it," he said, "but I needed you to hear this, not for pity, not for a second chance, but because it's the only truth I have left to give you." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. "I didn't come empty-handed," he said, handing it to her. "It was a sonogram, dated weeks ago. I've kept every update you sent," he said. "Every message, every picture before you stopped replying. I didn't reach out again because I didn't want to pressure you, but not a day has passed where I haven't thought of this child. Of you." Elena studied the photo. Her fingers trembled slightly. She handed it back without speaking. The air grew still again. A bird flew past. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. Life continued. Silas stood slowly. "I'll leave you now. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know you were never a second choice. Not for a second. You were the real thing." He turned to go. "Silas." He paused. Alina rose to her feet. "I don't know what comes next," she said, "but thank you for telling the truth." He nodded. Then quietly, he walked away. Alina remained standing for a while after he left. The bench behind her stayed empty, but her heart wasn't. Not full, not broken, just steady. She reached down, ran her hand gently across her belly, and exhaled. That conversation had taken something out of her, but it had also given her something back. Clarity, control, closure in part. Later that evening, she sat at her desk, opened her journal, and began to write, not to Silas, not to the baby, but to herself. You did not make him lie. You did not deserve silence. You believed because your heart was open, and that is not a weakness. It's a gift. The following days were quiet again, but not heavy. She moved through her routines with more awareness. Meals tasted better, air felt fresher, the baby's kicks became more distinct. Everything around her seemed to shift slightly. She began preparing more intentionally, folding clothes, organizing, diapers, reading parenting books, not out of panic, but with purpose. It was as if hearing the truth had unblocked something in her. She didn't feel stuck anymore. She felt ready. And yet, late at night, when the house had settled and the wind whispered, outside the window, she would sometimes replay their meeting. The way he looked at her, not with expectation, but with regret, with tenderness that hadn't vanished, even if trust had. She didn't romanticize it, but she didn't erase it either. Silas had told the truth. Finally, in a way that cost him nothing and everything. And she honored that, not with a reunion, not with soft music or declarations, but with acceptance. She spoke to her therapist about the meeting. "I didn't expect it to change anything," she said. "And did it?" her therapist asked. "No," Alina replied, "but it gave me peace." Peace didn't mean forgetting. It meant making space for the truth, even if it arrived late. It meant choosing not to carry resentment into motherhood. She refused to let pain be her child's first inheritance. One morning, while journaling in the sunroom, she heard the baby's heartbeat. On the home monitor, a strong, steady rhythm that filled the quiet. She closed her eyes and whispered, "We're doing just fine." And she meant it. Nev brought over fresh fruit and helped Alina fold baby clothes. As they sorted through tiny onesies and soft blankets, Neve asked gently if he ever wanted to be part of the child's life. "What would you say?" Alina folded a blanket, placed it in a drawer, and said quietly, "We'll cross that when we get there. But I'll never let confusion enter our home. This baby deserves stability, even if that means I do it alone." That evening, Alina stood on her porch again, the sky painted in streaks of orange and gold. She thought of the woman she had been months ago, the one who stood silently, at the edge of a rooftop, watching everything she trusted fall apart. She wasn't that woman anymore. She was stronger now, wiser, calmer, not because life had spared her, but because she had learned to rise without needing someone to catch her. She took out her sketchbook that night, not the one Silas gave her, a new one, clean pages, a new beginning. She began to draw a woman standing barefoot in a garden surrounded by light, not because it had been handed to her, but because she had opened herself to it again. In her arms, a child, and behind her, a man, not close, not distant, just present. Unclear, unresolved, but not unwelcome. She titled it Possible because that's what life had become. Not perfect, not easy, but full of possibility. Alina didn't mark the exact moment she let go. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It didn't come with a declaration or a deep sigh. It came slowly, through days spent alone in truth, through quiet mornings with her hand on her belly and a voice inside whispering, "You don't need to be chosen to be worthy." It came through watching herself make decision after decision without consulting the memory of someone who no longer had a seat at her table. Her power returned quietly, but when it came, it stayed. There were messages from Silas that followed his visit. Respectful, spaced out. He didn't beg. He didn't push. Once he sent her a photo of the finished art studio, painted, furnished, open. He had named it the quiet room, just as she'd described. The message was short. "It's open now. Because of you." She didn't reply, not out of malice, but because the chapter had ended, and closure doesn't always need conversation. She found her rhythm again, walking every day, speaking life into her baby, smiling more, crying less. Her painting, still standing, had become something of a symbol in the community. A local cafe requested to hang a print. The town library asked if she would consider hosting an art talk about emotional healing. A high school teacher brought a class to her studio just to view it. She stood by the canvas one afternoon, tracing a finger along the strokes that once carried her heartbreak. It didn't hurt to look at it anymore. Now it told the story of a woman who refused to stay hidden inside someone else's mistake. One day, Nev found her sitting in the nursery corner, sorting through baby books. "You've changed," Nev said gently. Alina looked up, eyes calm. "No. I just remembered who I was." She began working on a new painting, one larger than any she'd attempted before. This one would be public, part of the town's annual spring art festival. She called it the Unfinished Bloom. It was layered, bold lines, soft blends, hands reaching not upward, but inward. At the center, a woman with her eyes closed and arms wrapped around her own shoulders. She wasn't reaching for someone else. She was holding herself. People noticed the shift in Alina. It wasn't just that she smiled more or moved more freely. It was the lightness in her voice, the certainty in her steps, the way she spoke without apology or hesitation. She no longer worried about how her choices were seen. She didn't wait for outside permission to be proud of herself. One afternoon, while preparing to hang her latest work at the festival, a local reporter stopped her for a quote. "What do you want people to feel when they look at this?" The woman asked. Alina paused, resting a hand on her stomach. "I want them to remember that peace doesn't come from being loved by someone else," she said. "It comes from loving yourself enough to walk away when the love offered isn't real." The quote was published beneath her photo in the town newsletter the following week. Neighbors clipped it. Mothers saved it. Girls in her class whispered about how strong she was. But Alina didn't care about admiration. She cared about truth. And finally, she was living in it. As her due date neared, she wrapped up the final pieces of her work projects. She made room for rest, for soft music, for warm baths and fresh linens and new beginnings. Every item in the nursery had a story now. Nothing was accidental. Everything had been chosen with care. She sat by the window one evening, the sun fading, birds settling outside, journal in hand. And she wrote, "I didn't lose anything. I was redirected, away from what was small, towards something I didn't even know I deserved." Choosing yourself isn't easy, but it's powerful. If you've ever walked away from something toxic, comment, "I chose me" below. And don't forget to subscribe for more life-changing stories just like this one. The night before the festival, Alina stood in front of her completed painting one last time. The Unfinished Bloom. It wasn't flawless. The strokes weren't perfect. But that was the point. It was honest, raw, beautiful in its truth. She hadn't painted it for praise. She painted it because she needed to prove something to herself. That even after the tears, the silence, the breaking, she could still create something powerful. The morning of the event was warm and bright. People strolled through town square, sipping lemonade and chatting beneath strings of lights. Local musicians played softly in the background as booths lined the sidewalks, each filled with color and story. Alina's piece stood at the center of the exhibit hall. It was placed on an easel with a small card that read, "A tribute to every woman who chose herself and never looked back." People stopped, stared, read the title, fell quiet. Some whispered, others didn't speak at all, but they felt it. They understood. Later that afternoon, a young woman, no more than 20, approached Alina with tears in her eyes. "I saw your piece," she said, voice trembling. "I didn't know how much I needed to see it until I did." Alina took her hand gently and said, "Then it did what it was meant to do." That evening, she returned home, kicked off her shoes, and curled up in the nursery chair with a blanket. The baby moved again, stronger now, more certain. Alina closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Peace, not silence, but peace. There were moments she thought of Silas, not in longing, not in bitterness, just with understanding. He had given her something important, unintentionally, a mirror, one that forced her to see what she needed, what she'd settled for, and what she'd never allow again. And for that, she was strangely thankful, not because he had stayed, but because he hadn't. That night, she wrote one final letter. Not to send, not to read aloud, just to release. You could have chosen me. You didn't. And that used to hurt more than I could admit. But now I see that choosing me was never your job. It was mine, and I did, finally, fully, and forever. She folded the letter and placed it inside a book on her nightstand, the same one she read from each morning. She didn't need to revisit it. She had written her way into wholeness. A few days later, while walking through town, she passed the local gallery and saw a framed print of her work in the window. Below it, someone had written on a note card, "Not everything that ends is a loss. Sometimes it's the beginning of who you were meant to become." She stood there for a long moment, then smiled and walked on. She had nothing to prove, no one to chase, nothing to regret. She had chosen peace. She had chosen her child. She had chosen herself. The early morning came quietly. No fanfare, no sudden rush, just the soft pull of a contraction and the undeniable awareness that her daughter was ready to meet the world. Alina rose from bed, moving slowly. She'd felt different the night before, restless, deeply present in her body. The kind of calm that feels like preparation. She called Neve, who was already on alert, and together they gathered her hospital bag, took one last look around the nursery, and stepped into the day that would change everything. The drive to the hospital was filled with silence, not the tense kind, but one laced with anticipation. Alina breathed through each contraction, eyes closed, fingers tracing soft circles across her belly. "She's coming," Niv whispered, reaching over to squeeze her hand. Alina nodded, tears rising gently. "She's ready. And so am I." Labor was long, but Alina didn't feel alone. The nurses moved with quiet kindness. The room was softly lit. Each breath she took reminded her of everything she'd endured, everything she'd released. When it was time, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. "God, give me the strength to welcome her with peace." And then, after hours of effort, grit, and grace, came the sound that melted every memory of pain. A cry, small, sharp, fierce. They placed her daughter on her chest, and time seemed to pause. Tiny, warm, perfect. Alina cradled her close, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "Hello, Aurelie," she whispered. "You're finally here." The name had come to her months ago. Aurelie Hope. A name that held softness and strength. A name that meant light. A name that was hers alone to give. Aurelie's skin was warm against her own, her breathing soft and steady. Her fingers curled instinctively around Alina's. It was more than a moment. It was a miracle wrapped in breath and heartbeat. Alina had never felt so full, so rooted, so complete. There was no one else in the room. No cameras, no promises. Just a mother and her child. Two hearts, one beginning. Over the next few hours, everything blurred into a gentle haze. Measurements, swaddling, check-ins from nurses, quiet congratulations. Nev stood nearby, beaming with pride. "She looks just like you," she whispered. Alina smiled. "She's everything I never knew I needed." Aurelie's eyes fluttered open later that evening. Dark, curious, steady. Alina sat in bed, watching her daughter study the world from the crook of her arm. "I'll never let you wonder if you were enough," she whispered. "You were enough the moment you began." The hospital room was calm, sunlight drifting in through the window. Then came a soft knock. Alina looked up. Silas stood in the doorway, alone. No flowers, no suit, just a simple gray sweater, hands at his sides, uncertainty in his eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't motion him in. She waited. He stepped forward slowly. "I heard," he said quietly. "Neve sent a message. I didn't want to come without permission." Alina's voice was steady. "Why did you come?" Silas took a breath. "Because I needed to see her, to see you." For a long moment, silence settled between them. Then Aurelie stirred in Alina's arms, letting out a tiny sound that softened every corner of the room. Silas took a half step closer, eyes on his daughter. "She's beautiful," he said. "She is," Alina replied, adjusting the blanket gently around Aurelie's body. Silas kept his distance. He didn't reach. He didn't ask. Alina looked at him carefully. "Why now?" "Because I wanted my first moment with her, to be honest," he answered. "Not rushed, not staged, just real." Alina didn't move. but her voice lowered. You weren't there for the hardest parts. I know, he said. You left me carrying everything. I did. And now, I'm not asking for a place, I'm asking for a beginning, even if it's small. She studied him for a long time, then looked down at Aurelie, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms. Elena shifted slightly on the bed and nodded toward the chair near the window. You can sit, she said softly, but quietly. Silas lowered himself into the chair slowly, hands clasped together, gaze fixed on the child sleeping just feet away. He didn't speak again, and Elena didn't need him to. In that still room, a fragile peace settled. Not resolution, not reunion, but something honest. The hours passed slowly, gently. Silas stayed in the corner chair, saying little, watching. Elena fed Aurelie, sang softly to her, and moved with the quiet grace of someone who had found her rhythm, even through exhaustion. There was power in her stillness, a steadiness that didn't come from being held, but from holding herself together. When Aurelie drifted to sleep again, Elena laid her gently in the clear bassinet beside the bed. Silas stood, walking over without a word, and looked down at the baby. His expression was unreadable. Then, after a moment, he whispered, "She's everything I hoped she'd be." Elena glanced at him. "She's mine," she said, not possessively, but protectively. Silas nodded. "I know." There was no tension, just truth, no forced reconciliation, only a shared recognition of what had come to be. They were two people forever connected, not by a vow or a title, but by a child who breathed between their mistakes. After a while, Elena spoke again. "She'll never be caught between us." "She won't," Silas agreed. "She'll never have to wonder if she's wanted." "She's deeply wanted," he said, voice thick. Elena's eyes didn't soften, but they didn't harden either. "I'll protect her, Joy, even if that means protecting her from confusion. So if you ever step into her life, it has to be with consistency, not guilt, not gestures." Silas didn't flinch. "I understand." Then, without prompting, he reached into his pocket and placed a small paper envelope on the table. "What's this?" Elena asked. "A letter," he said. "For her, not now, not next week, but one day, when you feel she's old enough to read it. You don't have to give it to her. But if she ever wonders, I want her to know I thought of her before she ever opened her eyes." Elena stared at the envelope for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I'll keep it." Later that evening, as the sky outside the hospital window turned to a soft indigo, Silas stood to leave. "I won't come back unless I'm invited," he said. "But if ever there's a place for me, to know her, even from a distance, I'll be ready." Elena didn't answer, but she didn't stop him either. He walked out without looking back. She turned to the bassinet, watching Aurelie stir slightly in her sleep. Elena leaned over and brushed her fingers across her daughter's cheek. "You are my beginning," she whispered. "Not my second chance, my real one." That night, while the hospital lights dimmed and the hallways quieted, Elena wrote in her journal, her last entry before returning home. "I've learned that strength isn't about how loudly you fight for love. It's about how gently you choose peace. This is my peace, and her name is Aurelie." 2 days later, they went home. Nev drove. Elena sat in the back, her daughter cradled against her chest. As they turned onto her street, the neighbors had left small balloons tied to the fence, a few cards in the mailbox, a note on the front door that read, "Welcome home, Aurelie. You are already loved." Elena smiled, heart full. She stepped into the nursery with slow, reverent steps. The sunlight warmed the blanket in the crib. She laid Aurelie down, then knelt beside her, hands folded, heart still. "Thank you," she whispered, to God, to herself, to the journey that had shaped her. Not for the pain, but for the strength it revealed. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she didn't need to. She had already survived the storm. Now, she was living in the calm she had created, and in her arms was every answer she'd once begged for. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones where everything works out the way we hoped, but the ones where we learn to stand when everything falls apart. Elena's journey wasn't smooth. It wasn't neat, but it was real. A story of loss, of love, and of finding strength in the silence. She learned that peace isn't something others can give us. It's something we choose, one breath, one boundary, one brave moment at a time. She discovered that worth isn't tied to who stays or who walks away. It lives in how we show up for ourselves when no one else does. And she proved that motherhood, when rooted in love, can be the most powerful redemption of all. So if you're listening right now, carrying disappointment or standing at a crossroads, let this be your reminder. You don't need permission to begin again. You are allowed to choose yourself. And you are not alone. Maybe the endings we fear aren't endings at all. They're just beginnings we never expected. Alina didn't get the love story she planned, but she found something greater, herself.